Here's what you're about to find out. How Canada built one of the most advanced fighters in the world. Why it was killed before it could prove itself. And how the people who built it helped shape the American space program instead. On October 4th, 1957, 13,000 people stood on the tarmac at Malton, Ontario, outside Toronto. They were watching something Canada had never seen before. A supersonic interceptor designed and built entirely in Canada, meant to fly faster and higher than any fighter in the Western world. It was the CF-105 Arrow. The aircraft was enormous and advanced. It was 77 feet long, with a delta wing spanning 50 feet and twin vertical stabilizers rising more than 21 feet. It was designed to reach Mach 2 above 50,000 feet in temperatures that broke conventional alloys and at altitudes where unprotected consciousness lasted only seconds. It had fly-by-wire controls, an internal weapons bay, an integrated fire control system, and 2 engines that promised more combined thrust than anything in its class. The Minister of National Defense, George Pierce, called it the start of a new era in Canadian aviation. That same day, 6 time zones away, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The space age began, and the Arrow's moment on the tarmac was pushed off the front pages. The coincidence did not kill the program by itself, but it changed the conversation. Suddenly people wondered whether manned interceptors still mattered. The Arrow had been built for a very specific Cold War problem. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, the Soviet Union was developing long-range bombers that could cross the Arctic and strike North America. Canada's north was enormous, difficult to patrol, and impossible to defend by ground forces alone. The Royal Canadian Air Force needed an interceptor that could climb fast, fly far, survive Arctic conditions, and meet Soviet bombers before they reached populated areas. No aircraft on the market could do all of that, so Canada decided to build its own. The contract went to Avro Canada, part of the Hawker Siddeley Group. After the war, the Canadian government sold the Victory aircraft plant at Malton to Hawker Siddeley, and the site became the center of Canada's post-war aerospace industry. The company attracted engineers from across the Commonwealth and Europe. Its first major success was the CF-100 Canuck, a twin-engine all-weather interceptor that entered RCAF service in the early 1950s. It was rugged and dependable, and it served well in Canada and with NATO. But it was subsonic. Soviet bombers were getting faster, and by the mid-1950s the RCAF knew the CF-100 would not guarantee interception for much longer. Canada needed a leap, not an upgrade. Design work on the Arrow began in 1953 under Chief Engineer James C. Floyd, a British-born aeronautical engineer who had already led the CF-100 program. He assembled a team with expertise in supersonic aerodynamics, metallurgy, electronics, and weapons integration. One of the most important members was Jim Chamberlain, whose methods were considered years ahead of the industry. The engine problem nearly killed the program before the aircraft ever flew. The original British engine was cancelled. The American backup was cancelled too. In most programs, that would have been fatal. Instead, Orenda Engines, in the same Malton complex, developed the PS-13 Iroquois from scratch. The Iroquois was a twin-spool axial-flow turbojet that produced about 19,250 pounds of thrust dry and more than 25,000 in afterburner. It was lighter and more powerful than the competing engines, and it was entirely Canadian. Before the full aircraft was built, Avro ran one of the strangest test programs in aviation history. It launched 9-foot scale models of the Arrow over Lake Ontario on Nike rocket boosters. The models reached supersonic speeds, transmitted aerodynamic data, and sank into the lake after their runs. The engineers already knew the design worked before the first full-size aircraft was ready. Construction began in 1955 with major government funding. Avro made a risky decision. It skipped the traditional hand-built prototype stage and went straight into production tooling. The first aircraft would be production standard machines, not experimental one-offs. The urgency was simple. The RCAF needed the fighter in service as soon as possible. The first 5 aircraft, designated Arrow Mark I, used American Pratt & Whitney J75 engines as temporary power plants, while the Iroquois completed testing. The 6th, RL-206, was meant to fly with the Canadian engine in its final configuration. By 1957, Avro and Arrow employed about 15,000 people. Under President Crawford Gordon Jr., the wider company had expanded through acquisitions into a huge industrial empire involved in steel, coal, rail equipment, avionics, and aircraft. By 1958, Avro Canada was one of the largest corporations in the country. The Arrow was the flagship of that system. On March 25, 1958, test pilot Jan Zurakowski flew the Arrow for the first time. Zurakowski was a Polish-born RAF veteran and an accomplished test pilot. The maiden flight went well. The aircraft handled beautifully. By the third flight, it had gone supersonic. In later tests, it reached Mach 1.9 on interim engines that were much heavier than the Iroquois. The airplane was already nearing Mach 2 with the wrong power plant. The data confirmed what the engineers had predicted. The aircraft worked. The international reaction was enthusiastic. Aviation Week called the Arrow a serious contender for the most advanced military aircraft of the coming years. Flight magazine described it as the biggest, most powerful, and potentially fastest fighter yet seen. Soviet designers who visited the plant in 1958 reportedly thought it was an excellent aircraft and were puzzled that its future was uncertain. Its problem was never aerodynamics. The trouble was political and financial. Costs had climbed, as they do on ambitious military programs. The original per-plane estimates had been far too optimistic. At the same time, the Arrow's weapon system was falling behind. The Astra fire control system was late and over budget. The Sparrow 2 missile was cancelled. Then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker's government began to argue that missile defense, not manned interceptors, was the future. Sputnik had proved the Soviets could launch satellites and, by implication, ballistic missiles. If the main threat was intercontinental missiles, why keep funding a supersonic bomber interceptor? The argument was convenient. It was also premature. Soviet bombers did not vanish. The threat from manned aircraft continued for decades. But in Ottawa, the missile story gave political cover to a cancellation that was already becoming likely. On September 17, 1958, Crawford Gordon tried to force the issue in a meeting with the Prime Minister. He demanded the program be saved. Diefenbaker rejected him. Gordon left knowing the Arrow was finished. Canada also tried to sell the aircraft abroad. The United States and Britain showed no real interest. Neither wanted a Canadian competitor when they had their own programs. The Arrow had been designed for a uniquely Canadian problem, and only a full national commitment could have carried it through. It got neither rescue from abroad nor full support at home. On February 20th, 1959, Diefenbaker announced in Parliament that the Arrow and the Iroquois were cancelled immediately. The scheduled review never happened. At Moulton, workers heard the news over the factory loudspeaker. All employment was terminated. About 14,000 employees were laid off at once. That day became Black Friday in Canadian aviation history. Subcontractors lost orders. Shops and services closed. Families left the communities built around the plant. By the time Avro Canada was formally dissolved in 1962, total job losses across the aerospace network were estimated at 25,000. Then came the most infamous order of all. 2 months after the cancellation, the government ordered every Arrow destroyed. All 5 completed airframes were cut apart. The 6th, RL-206, which had flown with the Iroquois, was destroyed too. Workers used blowtorches and sent the wreckage to a scrap dealer. Blueprints were burned or shredded. Tooling was scrapped. Film footage was ordered destroyed. The official reason was security. Critics have always argued the real reason was political. No one wanted a surviving Arrow that could prove the decision wrong. Whatever the motive, the result was complete. The most advanced fighter Canada had ever built was reduced to scrap metal. Only a nose section survives in the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa, along with a few scattered fragments and a single engine. No flyable aircraft remain. Canada's choice stands out because other countries often preserved failed aircraft as engineering records. Britain kept TSR-2 material. The United States preserved experimental aircraft. The Soviet Union kept prototypes. Canada chose erasure. The economic damage did not end with the factory. The engineers and technicians had to go somewhere, and many of them went south. Within weeks of Black Friday, NASA came north. The American space program, still in its early Mercury phase, needed engineers badly. Jim Chamberlain, the Arrow's chief of technical design, was recruited immediately. He led a group of Avro engineers to the United States in 1959. Many more followed. These were not junior hires. Chamberlain became head of engineering for Project Mercury and later helped design Gemini, the spacecraft that made orbital rendezvous and docking possible. Without that work, Apollo would not have been possible in the form it took. Other Avro engineers spread through the aerospace industry in the United States, Britain, and Europe. Some contributed to the Concorde. Others joined major firms like Boeing and Lockheed. Canada had trained a generation of top-tier aerospace talent and then lost much of it to foreign programs. One of the worst losses for Avro became one of NASA's biggest gains. Meanwhile, the Arrow's cancellation did not solve Canada's defense problem. The replacement systems were more expensive and less capable. Canada bought second-hand American F-101 Voodoos and later accepted missile systems that required nuclear warheads, which became politically divisive. The logic that killed the Arrow collapsed quickly. The bomber threat remained. The replacement cost more. The country spent more money to buy less capability from abroad than it would have spent to continue its own program. The political lesson was lasting. Canadian defense procurement became more cautious, more foreign-dependent, and far less ambitious. The price of trying to build something original had been made obvious to every future government. Crawford Gordon resigned in 1959 and died in New York in 1967, worn down by the collapse of the company he had helped build. James Floyd continued his career elsewhere. Jan Zurakowski retired quietly in Ontario and rarely spoke publicly about the Arrow. Canada has not built another frontline combat aircraft of its own since. Every fighter the Canadian military has flown since then has been bought from the United States. The Voodoo, the Starfighter, the Hornet, and later foreign designs. The ability to conceive, design, test, and produce a world-class supersonic interceptor with an indigenous engine was never rebuilt. Avro Canada survived only in memory. It was later acquired and absorbed, and the Moulton factory became an airport and a shopping center. A museum preserves the story, but most people driving by have no idea what once stood there. The Arrow's story is not really about a failed airplane. It is about what happens when a country builds something extraordinary and then loses the nerve to keep it alive. The aircraft itself was no failure. It met its targets. It flew supersonic. It was close to proving the promise of the Iroquois engine. The cancellation was political. The destruction was political. The replacement systems cost more and did less. The engineers did not disappear. They went to NASA and helped build the machines that carried humans into orbit. The country that built the Arrow bought second-hand jets instead. That is what remains of the Avro Arrow, a nose section in a museum, a trail of engineers who changed the American space program, and the memory of a machine that was killed before it could finish proving itself. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a blueprint story in another country. The Arrow had its own. In both cases, the engineering survived the politics only in fragments. That final contrast is what gives the story its lasting force. The Arrow was not cancelled because it was a crude machine or an impossible dream. It was cancelled because decision-makers chose to stop believing in the future it represented. Once that happened, the aircraft's technical achievements mattered less than the narrative built around them. A generation of Canadians grew up hearing that the project was too expensive, too ambitious, or too risky, even though the real record was more complicated. For the engineers, the lesson was harsher. They had built a system that depended on stable support, long timelines, and confidence from the state. When that confidence vanished, no amount of aerodynamic excellence could save the program. The Arrow therefore became a warning as much as a triumph. In aerospace, the best design in the world still needs political patience to survive. That is also why the Avro diaspora matters so much. The people who left Moulton did not simply take jobs. They carried methods, habits, and standards into other programs. In the United States, those standards helped shape spacecraft that had to function in a new and unforgiving environment. The irony is striking. A fighter designed to stop bombers helped train the people who would help send astronauts into space. Canada lost the aircraft, but it exported the knowledge. That outcome is painful, yet it is also a measure of how deep the achievement really was. A weak program does not leave that kind of wake. The Arrow did. In that sense, the Arrow still serves a purpose decades later. It reminds readers that technological progress is never only about metal, thrust, or speed. It is also about institutions willing to tolerate risk long enough for a difficult idea to become real. Canada did that once. Then it stopped. The result was one of the most remarkable near misses in aviation history. Its legacy is not a finished aircraft, but a standard of what Canada once proved it could build. That is why the Arrow still matters in Canadian history and in aerospace history more broadly. It remains a lesson in ambition, loss, and unfinished possibility.